I sold everything to come to America. It was the biggest mistake of my life. I was on my knees on the cold floor of an apartment in Newark, New Jersey, with $42 in my bank account, my cracked screen phone in my hand, and a message from my mother I couldn't bring myself to answer. She was asking if I was okay. I looked at those four walls, at the window facing a dark alley, at the suitcase I still hadn't managed to fully unpack in 3 months, and thought, I sold everything I had to get here. My home, my jewelry, my children's future. And for what? Let me tell you from the beginning, because the story I'm about to tell you is not the one you'll find in WhatsApp groups full of green card photos and Times Square selfies. This is the story no one posts. The one we hide from relatives, pretend doesn't exist, cry about alone in the bathroom so the children won't be scared. My name is Priya Venkataraman. I'm 41 years old. I was born in Coimbatore, in Tamil Nadu, in southern India, in a family that believed in two things above all else: education and reputation. And it was precisely because of those two things that I destroyed my life. Coimbatore is not just any city. For those who don't know it, it's called the Manchester of South India because of its textile factories, its intense pace, its hard-working people who believe that sweat is currency. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood with a joint family of 18 people living under the same roof. Grandparents, uncles, cousins, sisters-in-law, in-laws, even before I had a husband. That house smelled of filter coffee early in the morning and incense all day long. It was noisy. It was suffocating at times, but it was mine. It was the only world I knew, and I gave all of that up thinking I was going somewhere better. When I was 27, I married Suresh, an arranged marriage like most of my generation. He was a software engineer, working at a company in Bangalore, the son of a good family from Tirupur. My mother said he was a blessing from God. My father cried with joy. I barely knew the man, but I felt he was kind, that he had honest eyes, and that sometimes that's enough to make you take the leap. The dowry my family paid was the equivalent of almost 2 years of my father's salary. 2 years. No one said it was too much. It was what was done. It was the price of security. The first years of marriage were good in the sense that they were bearable. And when you grow up in a culture where marriage is an institution above all else, bearable is already considered a success. We had 2 children, Arjun and Meena. Suresh got a better job. We moved to our own apartment in Bangalore, and for a while, I thought I had arrived somewhere. I worked as an accountant at a mid-sized company, sent money to my mother every month, took the children to visit their grandparents during school holidays. My life had a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it had a rhythm. That was when the American dream slipped through my window like a snake, silent and beautiful, before showing its teeth. Suresh's cousin, Karthik, had gone to the United States 8 years earlier. Every Diwali he sent photos. Big car, house with a garden, children with Disney backpacks. When he came to visit the family once, he was wearing expensive clothes, speaking English mixed with Tamil, and everyone at the dinner table looked at him as if he were an upgraded version of a human being. The children wanted to sit next to him. The elders asked his opinion on everything. I watched all of this with a mix of admiration and discomfort I didn't know how to name at the time. Today I know the name. It was envy, and it was fear. Suresh started talking about an H-1B visa. He researched, studied, applied 3 years in a row to the lottery, and lost 3 times. Each defeat left a different kind of silence in the house. He didn't speak, but I could see it. The way he looked at the children in their school, a good school, but not good enough, according to him. The way he came home from work and spent the evening on his phone watching videos of Indians in Silicon Valley talking about stock options and green cards. He was already leaving, even without going anywhere. And I was afraid of losing him before I understood that I should have been afraid of losing myself. In the 4th year, he was approved. The visa came through. The company sponsored it. And what happened next was an avalanche I didn't have the strength to stop. And I'm not even sure I wanted to stop it, because the truth is that I believed too. God, how I believed. The decision to sell the apartment was presented as obvious. We needed money to start over there, Suresh said. The first months would be hard, costs were high, and his salary, though good in dollars, wouldn't cover everything right away with the whole family. We sold the Bangalore apartment. Money from 12 years of installments, of sacrifice, of giving up vacations and new clothes to make the payments. gone with a signature. My jewelry was the second thing, the wedding jewelry, the pieces my mother had given me, the ones her mother had given her. Gold from 3 generations of women who believed that stored metal was stored security. I told myself it was just metal, that I would buy other jewelry there, that gold is gold in any country. I lied so well that I convinced myself. We arrived in Newark on a Sunday in November. It was a cold I had never felt in my body before, the kind of cold that isn't just temperature, it's absence. The children were quiet in the taxi from the airport. Mina looked out the window and asked where the trees were. I told her they were sleeping. She accepted that. Children accept too much. The apartment Suresh had rented before we arrived was smaller than my children's bedroom in Bangalore. 2 rooms, noisy heating, a neighbor who slammed doors in the middle of the night. I stood at the entrance with my suitcase and felt something break inside me. It made no loud sound. It was silent, like thin glass, but I still didn't know the worst of it. The first days I functioned on autopilot. That's the defense mechanism no one teaches you, but everyone discovers at the right moment. When the pain is too great to process, the body simply carries on. Wakes up, makes coffee, gets the children ready, smiles when it needs to smile. I did that for weeks. I'd open my eyes in the morning in that small Newark apartment, hear the sound of the subway outside, smell the different air, that smell of old construction and electric heater that never fully left my memory, and lie there for exactly 2 minutes convincing myself that everything was fine. Then I'd get up, because that was what I knew how to do. Suresh started working the week after we arrived. He left early, came home late, and when he came home he was so exhausted he barely spoke. I understood. The pressure was enormous. It was a new environment, colleagues he needed to impress, a work culture completely different from the Indian one, where you can't just be competent. You have to be visible, know how to sell yourself, speak up in meetings. Suresh was a quiet man, a brilliant engineer who preferred to let his code speak for him. There, code wasn't enough. He came home with an expression I started calling internally his battle face. I didn't ask too many questions. I thought I was sparing him. In truth, I was sparing myself from hearing that things were not going well. The children were enrolled in the neighborhood public school. Arjun was 11 and Mina was 8. On the first day, both came home in silence. Mina went straight to the bedroom she shared with Arjun because we didn't have space for more and lay down staring at the ceiling. I asked what had happened. She said no one had played with her at recess because she couldn't follow the other children's fast English, and she had stood in a corner. 8 years old, standing in a corner in a strange country because her mother thought she was doing what was best for her. That went into me like a knife, but I swallowed it. I said it would get better. I said she'd soon have plenty of friends. She looked at me with those eyes children have when they don't believe what their mother is saying, but don't want to hurt her. I looked away. My situation was, in many ways, worse than the children's. At least they had school, had structure, had somewhere to go every day. I had the apartment. The visa I had entered on was dependent on Suresh's, which meant I couldn't work. I couldn't simply go out and look for a job, couldn't use my qualifications, couldn't be an accountant there the way I had been before. I stayed home, cleaned the apartment, which was clean in 40 minutes because it was too small to take longer, cooked, waited for the children to come back, waited for Suresh to arrive, waited for something to happen. Never in my adult life had I been still like this. In Coimbatore, even before I was married, I worked. In Bangalore, I worked. Work had always been part of who I was, not just for the money, but because it made me feel I existed outside my role as wife and mother. Without work, I began to disappear to myself. I'd wake up in the morning and ask myself, what am I today? And the answer was, dependent. Dependent on his visa, his salary, his decision to come here. The isolation was of a kind I don't know how to describe well in words, but I'll try. In India, even on bad days, you were never truly alone. There was the neighbor who knocked on the door to borrow the rolling pin and stayed an hour talking. There was the sister-in-law who showed up unannounced, and you complained, but deep down it was good. There was the noise of the street, the vegetable vendor shouting his prices, the child from the floor above running around, the temple 2 blocks away chiming at 6 in the morning. All of that, which sometimes irritated me, was actually proof that I was part of something larger than myself. In Newark, the silence was heavy as concrete. Neighbors didn't greet each other in the hallway. The supermarket was an experience of non-encounter. Everyone with headphones, eyes on their phones, cart as a shield. I tried twice to start a conversation in the checkout line, as I would naturally do in Coimbatore, and people responded with a quick, dry smile that politely means, "Don't talk to me." I learned fast. I started calling my mother every day, sometimes twice a day. She would ask how I was. I would say great. She would ask if I was eating well. I would say yes. She would talk about news from Coimbatore, who had gotten married, who had had a baby, a cousin who had opened a fabric shop. I listened to those stories like someone dying of thirst, hearing another person describe water. When I hung up, I cried. Not the loud kind of crying that I saved for the shower with the water running. It was a quiet cry from someone learning to do everything in silence. It was in the 3rd month that the financial situation showed its true face. Suresh came home on a Friday earlier than usual. He sat at the kitchen table, which was the only table we had, and stared at his hands for a while. I knew before he opened his mouth. There's a language in people's bodies that you learn to read after years of marriage, a language that goes beyond words and arguments and chosen silences. That was the body of a man carrying news he didn't want to carry. The company had cut his team. Restructuring, they said. Position eliminated. He had 90 days to find another employer to take over the visa sponsorship, or we would have to leave the country. 90 days. I stared at him without being able to speak for a length of time I couldn't measure. Then I asked, with a calm that still surprises me, "How much money do we have in the account?" He told me the number. It was less than I had imagined, much less. The expenses of Newark, the cost of living, the rent that was nearly double what we had calculated. Everything had eroded the savings faster than we had foreseen. $42? Not yet. But we were weeks away from getting there. That night, after the children fell asleep, I went to the bathroom, turned on the shower, sat on the cold tile floor, and allowed myself to think for the first time about what I had done. Not what had happened to us, what I had done, because I had chosen to. I had signed too. I had said yes when I could have said wait, or could have said no, or could have said give me time to think. But the cruelest truth of all was something else. I had said yes because I was afraid that if I didn't, he would go without me. There's something no one tells you about a real crisis, not the movie kind of crisis, with dramatic music and rain on the window and someone hugging you at just the right moment. A real crisis is bureaucratic. It's a list of urgent things that keeps growing while you're trying to breathe. It's the phone ringing from an unknown number. It's a form that needs a document you don't have. It's a deadline that won't wait for you to finish crying. In the days that followed that night on the bathroom floor, I learned that surviving is not a beautiful thing. It's just keep putting one foot in front of the other, even when the ground feels like it's about to give way. Suresh started sending his resume to everyone he knew. Social media, WhatsApp groups of Indians in tech, former college classmates scattered across the United States. The Indian community has this going for it, you have to acknowledge. When someone is in trouble, the network mobilizes. Within 2 days, there were already referrals, contacts, names of recruiters who specialized in visa transfers. There was hope in the air, but the nervous kind, the kind that keeps you awake at 3 in the morning, doing mental calculations of how much time we have, how much money is left, how many days until the deadline runs out. I started doing something I hadn't done in months. I started researching. I'd open the computer after the children went to sleep and spend hours reading about dependent visas, about the possibility of changing status, about what happened to families in our situation. I joined forums, closed Facebook groups for Indian immigrants, read testimonials from people who had been through the same thing. Some stories ended well, many did not. All of them had one thing in common. No one had planned to end up there. It was in one of those forums that I found the story of a woman from Hyderabad who had been undocumented for 93 days because the visa transfer process was delayed. She described the fear of leaving home, of dropping her children at school and not knowing if she'd be able to pick them up, of every siren in the street making her heart race. I read that and felt my stomach turn, not in judgment, in recognition. That was the edge I was standing on. I called my mother that week, and for the first time I couldn't keep the mask on. I didn't plan it. It happened in the middle of an ordinary conversation. She was talking about a neighbor, and suddenly I was crying on the phone and couldn't stop. She was silent for a moment, and then said, in that calm voice mothers use when they're frightened but can't show it. "Tell me what's really going on." And I told her everything. The small apartment, the isolation, Suresh's visa, the money running out, the jewelry that no longer existed. I told her things I had kept locked up for months with such care, as if keeping them hidden was protecting someone, when in truth I was only making myself sick alone. My mother listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "Priya, you sold what our family built over decades, but you are still here. That can be fixed. The rest cannot." I didn't fully understand what she meant in that moment. I would understand later. The turning point, if I can call it that, because it was not a pretty turning point, was a series of small collisions with reality that gradually shaped me back into some functional form. The first was when Mina came home from school one afternoon with a drawing she had made in class. It was a house, a big house, with a garden, with a sun in the corner, the way children draw. At the bottom, she had written in still crooked English, "My house in India," not the house where we were living. The house from before. I held that piece of paper and asked her if she missed it. She said yes, that she missed her grandmother, the neighbor's dog, the smell of Grandma's kitchen that was different from my kitchen. She said it without drama, with the brutal naturalness that only children have. Then she took the drawing, put it on the bedroom wall with a piece of tape, and went to play, as if missing something were simply something you admit, and then keep on living. I stared at that drawing for a long time. The second collision was with a woman named Lakshmi, whom I met in an Indian immigrant support group that a social worker from the Newark City office had referred me to. Lakshmi was from Chennai, 52 years old, had arrived in the United States 23 years earlier, and had been through worse than what I was going through. Much worse: the loss of a child, divorce, rebuilding from scratch in a foreign country. She spoke with a quiet firmness that wasn't hardness. It was something else. It was the firmness of someone who had walked through fire and discovered they hadn't turned to ash. The first time we spoke, she looked at me and said something that stayed with me. "You didn't come here chasing the American dream. You came here running from some Indian fear. And until you understand what that fear was, you'll keep suffering here the same way you would have suffered there." I was angry with her in that moment. Who was she to say that to me? I hadn't run from anything. I had come by choice, for my family, for my children's future. I went home angry, cooked dinner angry, put the children to bed angry. But at 2 a.m, lying in the dark with Suresh sleeping beside me, the sentence came back, and I sat with it. What was the Indian fear I had been carrying? It took me days to answer that honestly. The fear was this: I was 38 years old, with a reasonable life in Bangalore, a marriage that functioned but didn't fulfill me, and a growing feeling that I had reached the limit of what was possible for me within that world. It wasn't ambition for American money. It was dread of reaching 60 and discovering I had never tried anything different. And when Suresh's visa appeared like an open door, I jumped, not because I was certain it was right, but because I was afraid it might be my only chance to get out of where I was. Except I hadn't gotten out of where I was. I had just traded one cage for another. Understanding that didn't fix anything practically. Suresh was still unemployed. The deadline was still running. The money was still disappearing. But something shifted inside me in that moment, a kind of painful clarity that is different from despair, because despair paralyzes and clarity, even when it hurts, lets you see where you're stepping. That was when I made the decision that would change everything. Not the decision you're imagining. The decision was to call my father, not my mother, whom I had already called, who already knew everything, who was already carrying the weight alongside me from the other side of the ocean. My father, the man who had cried with joy at my wedding, the man who had paid the dowry without complaint, 2 years of his salary, because it was what was done, because it was the price of his daughter's security. The man with whom I hadn't had a real conversation since I was about 16, because in our family, as in so many Indian families, father and daughter love each other deeply and know each other superficially. There is a respectful distance that no one asked for, but everyone maintains. I called on a Tuesday morning while Suresh was in a video interview and the children were at school. I sat on the living room floor, back against the wall, and dialed the number I had known by heart since childhood. He answered on the second ring. As always, my father always answers on the second ring, as if he's been waiting, as if he knows. I said, "Dad, I made a mistake. I sold everything. and I got it wrong. Help me think about what to do." He was silent for a moment that felt very long. Then he said, "I know, Priya. Your mother told me. I was waiting for you to call. And that was it. No judgment. No, I told you so. No wounded pride from a father who had watched his daughter squander what he had built. Just, I was waiting for you to call." I cried so hard that he stayed silent on the other end, letting me cry on the other side of the world at 11 in the morning in Coimbatore, probably sitting in his usual chair by the window, drinking the coffee my mother had made, letting his daughter cry from across the ocean, because sometimes that is all a person needs. When I calmed down, we talked for nearly 2 hours, the longest conversation we'd had in decades. He asked me questions I hadn't expected him to know how to ask, about the visa, the deadlines, the legal options. My father had spent his entire life running a small textile factory in Coimbatore. He was not a man of technology or American immigration, but he was a man of problems and solutions. He said he had a contact, a friend of a friend, an immigration lawyer in Chicago, who was the son of Coimbatore, who might be able to advise us. He said he would make some calls. That afternoon, Suresh came back from the interview with a different expression. Not the usual battle face, something else. He sat down, was quiet for a second, and said, "I think it went well. I think they're going to make an offer." I looked at him, and for the first time in months I saw the man I had chosen, beneath all the exhaustion and the pressure and the hard months. I saw the young man with honest eyes my mother had called a blessing, and I thought that maybe a blessing isn't the thing that requires no effort. Maybe a blessing is the thing that is worth the effort. The offer came 3 days later. It was from a smaller company, also in Newark, with a salary slightly below the previous one, but with guaranteed visa sponsorship and the possibility of a green card within 3 years. It wasn't the American dream of the wealthy cousins with their Times Square photos. It was a job, a fresh start, a chance not to have to go back with our tails between our legs, as I imagined my mother-in-law would describe the situation if we returned that way. We signed the contract on a Wednesday. That night I made dal tadka and rice, my mother's recipe, with the spices I had learned to find at a small Indian grocery store 3 blocks away. I put it on the table, called the children. Suresh looked at the pot and said, "It smells like your mother's house." I said I knew. That was the idea. But I need to be honest with you until the end, because this is not a happy ending story the way movies teach. Everything didn't suddenly become fine. The apartment stayed small. The Newark cold stayed heavy. Meena continued to take time making friends, and Arjun went through a difficult phase at school that cost us nights of worry and long conversations I wasn't sure I was having the right way. The isolation didn't disappear with Suresh's new job. I continued to be unable to work for many months while the visa transfer process ran its course. What changed was something else, smaller and larger at the same time. I stopped pretending I was okay when I wasn't. That may sound simple, but for a woman raised in a joint family in Coimbatore, where collective harmony is worth more than individual truth, it was an internal revolution. I started attending Lakshmi's group regularly. I started talking with other Indian women who were going through the same thing, some in worse situations, and I discovered that what I thought was my own weakness was actually a systemic condition. So many of us had come as dependents, literally dependents on paper in our visas, and we had let that dependency seep into us in ways that went far beyond the document. I began studying to have my accounting credentials recognized in the United States. It was a long process, expensive, full of obstacles, but it was mine. The first time I opened the study materials on an afternoon while the children were at school, I felt something wake up in me that I thought I had sold along with the Bangalore apartment. I hadn't sold it. It had just been sleeping. And my father called every week now. Short conversations, 10 or 15 minutes, but real ones. He asked about my studies, about the children, about how I was doing in my head. Once he asked how I was feeling, not how things were going, but how I was. I was so surprised I took a moment to answer. Then I said, "Stronger than I was before I came, weaker than I thought I was." He laughed and said that was exactly the right place to be. Today I am 41 years old, and I still live in that small Newark apartment, but it no longer feels like a prison. Meena has friends now. Arjun joined the school math team and talks about things I can no longer follow. Suresh and I don't have a perfect marriage. We never will. But we have an honest marriage now, which is different and better. Honesty came in after the crisis, the way light comes in through a crack. You don't know exactly when it started, you just notice that it's there. The jewelry didn't come back. The Bangalore apartment doesn't come back. The time the children lost, the years I spent erasing myself in silence, the conversation I should have had with my father decades earlier, none of that comes back. But let me tell you one thing, and this is where I want to end this story. If I could go back to that morning in Coimbatore when Suresh came home with the approved visa in his hand and that gleam in his eyes, I would not do the same thing. I would not sell everything. I would wait longer, plan better, have the hard conversations before rather than during. I would not come as a shadow on my husband's visa. I would come with my own ground beneath my feet, or I would not come at all. But I can't go back. And you, who are listening to me now, maybe you are at the beginning of this decision, or in the middle of it, or maybe you have already arrived at your own cold tile floor at 3 a.m. And what I want to tell you is this: the American dream is not a lie, but it is a story they tell incompletely. They tell you about the arrival, not the cost. They tell you about the green card, not about what you leave behind and never find again. They tell you about the successes of those who stayed, not about those who came back destroyed, or those who stayed destroyed without ever going back. I sold everything to come to America. It was the biggest mistake of my life, and also the thing that taught me who I am when I have nothing left to hide behind.